Hello.
Hello. Literally coming right from work there.
I am coming literally from work. Yeah, that's funny.
Like the rest of
Every
us.
10-second matters. Hi, everyone. Welcome to Empathy Power Up. Hi, Amy.
Hello. How do you do?
Good, good. This is April. April is our month of boundaries. And
Yes, it
yes,
is.
Um, really interesting topic. What's funny is now a lot of the media I'm watching, all these things where boundaries come up, and it's so interesting that like we're watching this show
Yeah.
on Netflix, Arlo, and it's a kids
Uh-huh.
show. And
Okay.
the most recent episode was about boundary setting.
Oh,
And
wow.
I'm like, oh my gosh, the zeitgeist moments of this. But welcome
Yeah.
everyone. We're talking about boundaries. Why are they important? What are the different kinds of boundaries? How do we understand them? How do we set our own boundaries? And we introduced the topic last week. And as we dive into this, and we're going to dive deeper into these details, and I'm going to learn, Amy's going to share, we're all going to have a conversation about this. Feel free to add in the chat. But just something to recap from last week is our boundaries are the essential building blocks of our relationships with others, our relationship with ourselves. And that's how we operate in the world. And they are our rules of engagement, our everyday expressions of consent. And I love this, our everyday expressions of consent. And we're going to dive in deeper in the space in which we navigate relationships and community. Oh, so important. And we started talking about physical boundaries last time to give you an example of what types of boundaries there are. But today, let's just dive in deep into the boundaries and just go in. Amy.
Yeah, absolutely. Oh my gosh, this has been a deep dive for me. Like I said last week, this is something I'm learning, but as I'm talking to more and more people and bringing it to my communities, I'm realizing there's so many people who have yet to work on their boundaries and could use a bit of a refresh if they have ever thought about boundaries before. So, the more I dive into this, I start seeing that boundaries are literally structuring how we live in this world. So, it means that understanding them is so fundamental to what we're doing, and it's we need it to be human.
Mm-hmm.
And healthy boundaries are as much about like interpersonal effectiveness as it is about social justice. As I'm reading in a lot of the books and things like that I've been reading about. But if we don't have boundaries, we are malleable, kind of like Play-Doh is.
Mm.
So, but then if we are malleable and don't set boundaries, then we can be controlled,
Ooh.
right? So when we talk about this concept of like the world is creating more narcissists and less empathetic people, um, it's so central to that because if we are going down this path of narcissism and less empathy, if we are as empathetic humans like you and me, or people who are trying to be empathetic, don't put boundaries up, you're in really rough territory there.
Yeah. And I love how you talked about like the concept of social justice is part of this conversation, as well as this idea of we are controllable. And I think those are linked, but I would love to understand your perspective there. But the part that I think that's so important is when we feel manipulated, when we feel controlled, it's because we don't have boundaries with ourselves, when we don't have boundaries with others, and we have not explicitly
Yep.
communicated those boundaries. And sometimes we're unaware that we're being controlled.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah.
Yeah. Absolutely, right? And so and that creates a sense of resentment, right? And
Oh yeah.
yeah, you're like, oh my gosh, yeah, something doesn't feel right, you know? And and like we're going to have those feelings, but the more we go dive deeper into those like boundaries, the better off we're going to be able to understand and just be like, oh, that's a boundary that you've crossed, and
Mhm.
I'm not going to let you cross that anymore,
Right.
right?
Right.
So nuanced, you
Yeah.
know?
And people generally have like some firm boundaries, but I think what's important is there could be the smaller boundaries that we are even unaware that they're being crossed, right? And
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
those every day can sort of add up.
Yeah, exactly. And I think when it talks to um talking to the idea of social justice, and also just like at the end of the day, we all want to feel safer and more secure
Mhm.
in how we navigate the world, right?
Mhm.
And so boundaries will help us feel safer and more secure in the world, because in a world that is like anything but safe, especially now. Like, I was just walking down the street last night with one of my friends, and there was a shooting, like literally 2 blocks from my place. It's happening all the time. We're seeing this in lots of different ways, but it's just like, obviously it seems like it's not a safe world, but this is a way for you to bring a little bit of control, so to speak, but not, overt control. And I'll talk
Mhm.
about that in a minute, about what are ways you can set some boundaries and what kinds of boundaries there might be.
A-
So yeah,
Amy,
good.
what brings this, that's interesting, like all these things you sort of thought about it, is I would love to understand what is the impact of having boundaries, or like I would love to work
Mm,
back from understanding that, because like you said, you mentioned boundaries help us feel safer and more secure. And I
mhm,
think that's so important to think about the why of boundaries.
mm, mm. Yeah, I think the thing instead in our modern culture today, boundaries are usually defined by a lack of words or actions. So if we don't have a conversation about boundaries, this sends the message that these things aren't worth talking about, right? And then that means that they don't matter, and then you can interpret it to be
Mm.
like, then that what I want and need and desire doesn't matter, you know
Right.
um and then and that who we are in relation to others doesn't matter either. And so it kind of goes into our everyday interactions, and that's
Right.
what's so central to this work, right? And I was like, oh my
Yeah.
gosh, it's everywhere.
Yeah, and we were talking on the phone yesterday, but I think it came up with like the comments Representative Cawthorn, Madison Cawthorn
Yes,
made
right.
about, he's like, so what if a guy wants to go kiss a girl? And that is, to me, that comes back to no one has had a conversation about boundaries with with
Hmm.
this person. It's like
Hmm.
they're like, when people are setting boundaries, they're like, whoa, I didn't grow up with boundaries, so now you're suddenly setting boundaries, so are you calling me a monster? Are we monsters? Don't care about boundaries? And I think that
Yeah,
is an
yeah.
important, if someone crosses boundaries, it's not it's because no one has had a conversation explicitly about these boundaries. And even if that is
Hmm.
the case, maybe they need to have boundaries about themselves that they are just unaware of.
Hmm. Yeah, and I was like, if it's also interesting too that deeper I think about this, is that when somebody doesn't respect your boundaries, that says a lot about them, and that
Mm.
you should walk away from them, or not have less of them in your life,
Mhm, mhm.
because those people are not going to aren't respecting you as a human. So that's why I wanted to make that connection about like if you don't set your boundaries, you aren't being truly human at work, in your life, right? What it means to be human is to live your life, but also be able to know that you're safe, and
Yeah.
be protected in the moment. And I think just in this society, like Madison Cawthorn's a prime example. He wasn't taught that. Like I mentioned in last call, my dad, who was a white man, wasn't taught about boundary setting either. About like, giving me a hug. He just could like take a hug from me, until I started saying, "Dad, that really doesn't feel good to me. I would prefer if you asked me first, before that happened." And then I felt like my relationship with my father could change,
Mm. Mm.
in those ways,
Yeah.
because it's a way to communicate to somebody that that's not what I want, right?
What's so prevalent in your story with your father, I think, is it was not as much about him as much as about you understanding your space, right?
Yes, yes. Yeah, it's about claiming my own space and not claiming other people's space.
Ah.
And when we don't set and maintain those boundaries, we end up being resentful, and withdrawn from the relationships. And that's what leads it to eventual breakdowns.
Yeah.
So think about that. Like, if you aren't speaking up and saying what you want, you can go to resent. And then I feel this all the time because I was not modeled this behavior growing up, right? To set boundaries. There was a lot of things in my life that, like, so when I came to making a decision, I didn't even know how I could make a decision because I didn't know. I just did what the other person wanted, right, and needed, rather than knowing what I want and need, and those things are like very much aligned, I'm thinking.
I think that's it's so, I think, like, the stories that come to mind as well are in even when we're children, right? When we're children and we're in school, we're around our peers, we're around other children. Boundary setting is almost ignored when someone is like, when someone is feeling bullied, or someone like, and they're like, oh, that's just Billy being Billy, or that's okay. And that's adults not even recognizing, like, this is someone's boundary that's being violated, and they're asking for help.
Yep. Yes. Yeah, exactly. And like, there's so many boundaries that I'm like learning about that I think I'm going to talk in next sessions about boundaries that I didn't even think that were boundaries, right? Because, like, if you don't become aware of them, right, it's like how you learn things is that you have awareness, you have experience with that thing, and you come to know that it's something that you've never learned before. And then if you take it up and start practicing it, then it becomes an unconscious thing. And that we do spend our entire lives doing this, like learning something new, becoming a novice at it, and then getting better at it, and then that goes to the back of our mind. So I think with boundary setting, it's a lot like that, in the sense of, like, you have to kind of be like, have this awareness about it and go through the process of it. Like, like jumping to like these ideas is like, there's different kinds of boundaries, right? There's I think this scaffolding, this foundation and scaffolding is really important to enforce boundaries. It requires us to like look into ourselves and also start conversations that we might not have had before. So it has that deep power. I talked about social justice, but it's not just self-changing work, it's also changing the world. It's world-changing work, right?
Yeah. And I think it starts with the self, right? Like you're saying, it's self-changing that impacts the world. It's a world-changing.
Yeah.
And I think you talked about a little bit. Boundary setting is also communicating our needs.
Yes, absolutely.
Right? It could be need to not be touched, or a need to touch, or a need to express in a certain way, right?
Yes.
And that is part of the boundaries, I think, conversation.
Yeah. And that's what really interesting. Like, talk about the love languages. I was just talking to my friend Salima about this last night. And she was like, the 5 love languages add the nuance of like physical touch, right? Is one of the 5 love languages. You both have a give and receive portion of that, right? I love to give touch, but I also like to receive touch, right? So that's a whole can of worms that I'm still like processing in my head, that I'm like, oh, giving gifts or receiving gifts, those are 2 different feelings for me, right? And so having that nuance can actually help you set your boundaries when it comes to relationships, and like, what are the bounds of this? And that's literally where boundaries come from. It's like, what are the things that says that this is the way you love me? Right. This is the way you take care of me, right? Yeah. Is another way of saying a boundary.
So. Yeah. And I think this idea of resentment is so impactful, because what ends up happening is we think that something that might be explicit or might be understood, and we explicitly did not have a conversation about it, that builds resentment, right? That slowly gets the chip away every day. It's like, oh, right, today, like if you had not communicated with your father, and every day your father is hugging you, every day you're feeling a little bit more uncomfortable, and that builds resentment towards them, and it then breaks down that relationship. And I think that is important to understand. So when even with spouses, with parent children, with all kinds of relationships,
friends,
friends, it's like, okay. And that's something I think is very interesting in my friend group in Seattle, like in our friends group. Boundaries are very clearly set and communicated. And if it's not, then we have a conversation about it. And that's why the friend group feels very like cohesive and safe to be around.
Yeah, absolutely. And it said, and one thing that, you know, as an example that came up in conversation with some of my friends recently too, because when you were mentioning friends, it made me think about this, is that one of my friends is in kind of like the kink community or the BDSM community here in DC. And that's for, you know, it's like, it's sexual kind of like bondage. Yeah, I know you know this, but for folks who are on the call,
That's true,
you know, like you might not know. It's kind of a sexual kind of environment, and that community actually thrives on boundaries and actually are so good at setting boundaries, which is so interesting. So maybe we can do a show just about like what, like bring somebody from the kink community to be like, hey, so because in order for you to navigate kink, this thing where it's like, do you like this or do you like this? You have to be able to have consent. And it is so necessary in that environment. You know,
I love it. Learning setting boundaries from like kink community is a brilliant idea. I love that. And I think you say it so well, because it is something that is talked about actively in that community. Like, what are your boundaries? What are your limits? Right?
Exactly. And then as I'm a single woman in this world of dating, some people ask me, what are your kinks? Right? Because it's a way of communicating to somebody what you like and what you don't like, you know? And so fascinating. And so like, this just like was a thing that occurred to me over the past weekend. So to bring this, I just want to make sure I get into like the different kinds of boundaries before we zip up here, because then next week we can go into, I'll just start off with like this story of me, like what it's like to not set boundaries. We'll talk about the different like kind of like the different ways you can set boundaries. But to close up shop on the different kinds of boundaries you can have, we talked about personal boundaries. We talked about property boundaries last week. We also have sexual boundaries, which those are the kinds of boundaries that you would have when it comes to touching is the physical and emotional aspects of sex. And I'm reading again from Unfuck Your Boundaries. And emotional relational boundaries are not just about how we want to feel and how others want to feel. They're even more about demonstrating our respect for our own personhood and the personhood of others. So this one's a little bit like nebulous for somebody who, it's not just like, this is property and don't touch my property. It's more about how do you, care about somebody's emotional needs, right? Then there's intellectual. Whoa, you got something? You got it?
Yeah, I was gonna say, like, vampire lore is such a great example of boundary question, because vampires, they have to be invited into your home. That's like a property boundary. Like they right. I mean, I know it's mythical, but it's like it's an example of like vampires cannot come into your home unless you invite them in. And I think that is part of this lore of like strangers coming to your home. It's a boundary of that physical property boundary.
Yeah. Oh, that's so interesting. So we went from like talking about kink and BDSM to talking about vampires, which I didn't think we were going to get to in this call today or in this session. To close this out, we also have intellectual boundaries. Intellectual boundaries are about our thoughts, beliefs, and ideas and how they're respected. Happens a lot. You know, you can imagine we got a very, very political country here, a very political world. So respecting those boundaries is really important, and who you allow to take and talk to you about them. And then finally, we have two more spiritual boundaries. So that's the one about our belief systems, how we practice them, and what we choose to share around those beliefs. And then the final one is time boundaries. And these are boundaries regarding one of our most precious resources, the expenditure of our minutes, hours, and days. So often like in the workplace, like last week in our Healing from Dysfunctional Workplaces group, which was like such an amazing like conversation. We all were like, we're going to work on this together. Like people spoke up and like not just spoke up and talked about, the lack of boundaries or boundaries that, that they haven't set for themselves. And this one comes up a lot in workplace. So for example, like the time boundaries that we talk about, you can say, I'm not going to take any calls, answer my emails after like 9 p.m. Right. Or if there's a period of time, like for example, right after this call, somebody wanted to put a meeting in the calendar for me. And I said, no, I like to de-stress after going live. So I can't have a meeting right now. And that's like a time boundary for me. So, those are really.
And I think what you mentioned about spiritual boundary also, I think is so important, because that boundary, I believe, is constantly violated in our societies and our systems. For example, we go to the Pride Parade and they're saying you are going to hell, or you are sinners, or people knocking at your home door and trying to give you into. I see it as a violation of my boundary, because I haven't set that invitation. I haven't said like, yeah, come talk to me about it. It should be more of a, here's a space where we can talk about it, you're welcome to join, versus pushing yourselves. And I think spiritual boundary is one that throughout the history of humanity has been violated constantly.
Oh yeah. Let's talk about like colonization, why don't we? Right? Let's just like, we don't even care about your boundaries at all, right?
Yeah.
So, so interesting, so much to dive into. And it was funny, we were just talking about this on the phone yesterday, that we were like, we thought this was just going to be one call, but like it's definitely
it's become a 2-month series. We're going to spend a year on boundaries.
For the next year, we're just going to talk about boundaries. How about that, guys? And you're going to go on this journey with us.
Well, we're going to wrap up. We're over time, but thank you so much. What an incredible conversation. So next week, we're going to kick off with a summary of this and then go dive into how do we set our own boundaries and how do we understand them.
And the steps involved. I'm going to tell a story about like when I was boundaryless and how that turned out for me.
Yeah.
And spoiler alert, didn't turn out so well for me.
Well, thank you, everyone. Please I invite your conversation, as well as invite you to reflect on your boundaries. Have you made them explicit, whether it be work, personal, with yourself?
Exactly. We're going to do this together. So thank you for your time, everyone. Also, thank you, Kevin, for joining me every week to talk about things like boundaries and geeking out on me on this. So
yay.
I love you so much. You're great.
Love you. Bye.
All right. Take care, everyone. Bye.